JNU and former Vice Chancellor, University of Jammu. I cordially invite him to deliver his address, which will be followed by a brief interaction chaired by Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi. Over to you, Professor Mattu.
Thank you very much, Sugandha. If I'm clear and audible, just let me know. And it is a great honor and a privilege to be here, particularly as part of this joint conference webinar between the South Asian University and the Bridge project. And I thank Carl Jason for inviting me. And I apologize for my tardiness in not responding with the alacrity that I normally do. But I'm delighted to be here. Although I don't see an audience, I imagine that if it's being live streamed, there is a virtual audience that I can't see. Having said that, let me, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, make three sets of points. One on the theme of the conference, which is education and sustainable development goals, and in this case, higher education and sustainable development goals. Secondly, looking at particularly South Asia, and finally, looking at some pointers about what we can do together. Because I understand that the Bridge project tries to bridge figuratively the world of academia, the world of theory, the world of ideas, and the world of policy, the real world of actually implementation. So I hope my presentation will do some justice to your concerns. I think it's widely recognized now that of all the 17 SDG goals, the quality education really stands out. In some ways, if the overall emphasis of SDGs is taking care of the planet in the larger sense of the word, taking care of all habitation and taking care of man, women, child, the environment, then quality education emerges as a central challenge, whether it's in terms of and the manner in which it impacts on all the other challenges. For instance, in terms of extreme poverty, in terms of hunger, in terms of ideas of good health and well-being, in terms of gender equality, in terms of affordable and clean energy, in terms of industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities, climate action, and particularly the last two, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnership for the goals. In all these ways, higher education particularly becomes central to our concerns. And that's why higher education is so important, and that's why I think it's so important that you have held this conference at this time. We also know that the higher education landscape in South Asia has expanded over the last 20 years. I remember I was in my policy avatar, in the policy hats that I've worn, apart from being Vice Chancellor, I was a member of the National Knowledge Commission, and also thereafter chaired the Knowledge Commission for Jammu and Kashmir. At that stage, we were looking at notions of expansion, equity, and excellence, but the emphasis was much more on expansion. But today, the landscape, if you look at about 50,000 higher education institutions across the 8 countries, and the private and the public sector playing a significant role in almost all the countries. In India and Nepal, for instance, about 65% of all higher education institutions are in the private sectors. India has about 960 or less than about 1,000 universities or higher education institutions. Similarly, and less so, but no less significantly, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, all of them have a vibrant private sector. So you have had, in terms of expansion, a tremendous expansion of higher education institutions. The what was described as the places where knowledge, ideas, particularly about inclusion and equity, will grow, are there existing in most of South Asia today. Indeed, your university was seen as a symbol of acting as a bridge between various countries of South Asia. However, what has happened, and this is the moot point, is the rupture that has happened because of the pandemic. The rupture on uh, the both both the limitations as well as the resilience. The limitations in terms of both equity and inclusion, and particularly excellence, but also the resilience in some ways of the ability of institutions to fight back, which is a source of inspiration in some ways. But the fact is that the most higher education institutions, the schooling sector, of course, was most poorly impacted, but the higher education institutions suffered no less. I am not completely aware of how South Asia University was able to bounce back or did not suffer because of the pandemic. But in a university like JNU, or in the universities in Jammu and Kashmir, two examples that I know firsthand, issues of access and equity became starkly clear. The most marginal groups were most poorly affected as hostels were shut down, internet access, which was the only way really of communication, was often either not present or there was weak internet connection. Gender especially became a focal point as young women who did not have access to internet at home, often their parents in rural backgrounds wouldn't allow them access to cyber cafes and so on. So even a university which is as privileged as JNU suffered suffered badly as a consequence of what happened during the pandemic and what continues to happen during the as we struggle to get out of the pandemic. Whether it is in terms of platforms, whether it's in terms of the strengths, even as I sit here in my residence in JNU, I'm not sure whether the bandwidth that I will get will sustain itself through my presentation. But much more so was also the large mental impact of the pandemic, and in terms of the transfer of knowledge, especially as young men and women got much more and more isolated because of the conditions that the pandemic imposed on us, and especially the restrictions that were imposed by the state during by the government to protect, as it were, the public health of our societies and states. So the pandemic has been, in some ways, probably the most significant event of not just this century but the last century, and it has demonstrated, as I said, the manner in which all the institutions, the mortar and brick institutions that we built, uh, was surprisingly fragile in terms of being able to cope with an event like this, and that marginal groups, particularly women and socially marginal groups, were most poorly impacted. It also had an impact on the quality of the transfer of knowledge, as compromises were made, semesters were cut down, coursework was curtailed, all sorts of jugaad was found, was created as a way of trying to bridge this gap. So on the one hand, as I said, you have had a huge proliferation of institutions. On the other hand, the pandemic demonstrated how fragile these institutions are. But as we are almost a year and a half into the pandemic, it all shows you that there was a certain resilience built into the human character, into the South Asian character, if I may say. There is a DNA. People bounced back, found ways, whether it was through through online learning, which was often not even credit based, through MOOCs, through massive online open courses, or through other devices, or through other ways in which people found a way to educate themselves. But this is not sustainable, certainly not sustainable if by 2030, which is the decade of action that we had defined for ourselves, we want to move forward. Therefore, I believe that this crisis, and every crisis, as the Chinese say, is also in some ways presents an opportunity. This presents an opportunity. It offers an opportunity to all the countries of South Asia, where we can now re-look at our education system, re-look at some of the security problematics that we created for ourselves or which we put forefront, not imagining how these non-traditional, as they were called in a cliched fashion, sources of insecurity will impact on our everyday life. It's time, therefore, for South Asian countries to move beyond those rigid, for want of a better word, Westphalian notions, or even post-Westphalian notions, and look ahead. And there cannot be a better place to start than higher education, where it's possible to cut through many of the contentious issues that often school education can lead to and school textbooks can lead to, by creating a seamless data network all over South Asia, to creating hybrid courseworks which cut across the geographies of South Asia, addressing to begin with, some of the common threats, which are embedded within the sustainable development goals, whether it is in terms of climate change or extreme poverty or gender equality or other issues of inequity and inclusion that confronts us. You do not, for once, in some ways, need the bureaucracies to act to, for instance, create a visa-less regime. In some ways, what you need them is to try and stop controlling our cyberspace, and the have in some ways, the bridge project can be a bridge for South Asia. You can have your own university, recognized and affiliated perhaps by to all the various university grants commissions of the various 8 South Asian countries. It's time that we let our imagination go beyond what we have so far not thought of. Because after this pandemic, what we need to do is to reimagine the world in a fashion where we can think big, imagine a future which goes beyond the past ossified ways of thinking. Let me finally, in the last 2 minutes, say that one of the concerns that you in this conference have talked about is peace and security, and of course that is something which is part of the SDGs. But what was the it's almost old-fashioned, but when Carl Deutsch talked about a security community, what was he talking about? It was a community of people of living in a geographical area, often in different states, who had agreed only on one thing, that they will not use violence, as a way of settling differences. Today, all of South Asia has a chance to agree to at least not use violence against our habitat and against ourselves, to create a security community, to create a peace community in South Asia through the instrument of education, through the instrument particularly of higher education. And I am sure that if there are leaders like Professor Chaturvedi, who has done pioneering work in this area, reimagining the cartographies that divide us, if we look at cyberspace as a point of unity, we can actually see in, say, 10 years from now, in some ways, the pandemic as a huge blessing in disguise. Thank you very much.
Professor Matu. Carl, can I go ahead?
Please.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Well, I must say I was absolutely mesmerized by your brief in terms of time, but extremely rich valedictory address. And let me say my takeaway from what you said this evening is the perspective from the cyberspace, from the outer space. Because I still remember that when Sputnik went up and we had the first visualization of the planet Earth, it acted as a catalyst for new ecological movements. And there was this very powerful normative appeal in terms of a new socio-spatial consciousness. In the same way, I think by making a reference today to the outer space and by making a very powerful normative appeal in support of pushing the envelope of our academic and policy imaginations, you have really, really provided us with a very befitting conclusion to what I thought was an absolutely incredible day. If I was telling my friends earlier today that one notebook was not enough, certainly, when it comes to taking note of the insights that were being shared. I heard some very powerful appeals, very powerful messages, including, of course, as I said, yours, which clearly underline the importance of acknowledging that we really live in unprecedented times. What has been very appropriately called the new geological and the new socio-economic epoch of the Anthropocene really reminds us of the fact that now the time is to take action. When you made a mention of the Knowledge Commission, Professor Matu, in which you played such an important role, I was also reminded of another commission, which is the Earth Commission. So the Earth Commission and the Knowledge Commission taken together are also a very powerful reminder of the fact that the contemporary times are the times of intersections. These are the times which can also be described as crossroads. And South Asia today certainly is at one such crossroads. These 17 SDGs and taking action on them in a timely manner, effective manner, is not a matter of choice, but it is a matter of necessity. Now, what are these intersections that we're talking about? We have been told by very distinguished panelists today that we are looking at the intersections of Anthropocene, we are looking at climate change, you also made a reference to it, we are looking at the challenge of sustainability, and also somewhere I did hear, relatively, I would say not expressed with as much emphasis as probably could have, the appeal to rethink the paradigm of development. After all, in sustainable development, it is not simply a matter of ecological sustainability. And we know that in this part of the world, and certainly locations continue to matter, in this part of the world called the Global South, ecological movements, the questions of sustainability are also deeply the questions of equity, justice, and inclusiveness. So it is understandable that when we talk about the challenge of sustainable development goals, we have to look at them in a holistic perspective. We have to appreciate that they are all interconnected. And when it comes to education, and the quality education and higher education, there was also a very powerful message that came out of the deliberations today, and that is that we need to appreciate the reality of diversity. Locations do matter. Locations in terms of opportunities, locations in terms of vulnerability, and they must be taken into account. Professor Madhu, I was listening to you, I was reminded of a website which I recently visited of UNESCO, where I came across a very interesting appeal to reorient curriculum in the era of Anthropocene, or in response to the call for Anthropocene. And there, I was struck by a reference to a wonderful work which was written by Edgar Marin way back in 2001. And the title of this very short booklet was 7 Complex Lessons in Education for the Future. And I am very tempted very quickly to quote from this book. Humans are physical, biological, psychological, cultural, social, and historical beings. This complex unity of human nature has been so thoroughly disintegrated by education divided into disciplines that we can no longer learn what human beings mean. This awareness should be restored so that every person, wherever he, she, they might be, can become aware of both their complex identity and shared identity with all other human beings, unquote. So I think there is a very important message here, which also resonates from your presentation when you were talking about the pandemic. Pandemics end in so many ways. Scientifically, they end when the science tells us. And unfortunately, we are also faced with what is called the post-truth and the denial of science. Science tells us that this is the time when you can probably venture out and the vaccine comes into play. There is another ending, which is the social ending. And social ending is when we say that, yes, we have come out of the fear. And once again, our life is full of hope and we feel confident enough to move forward. But I think there is third ending of the pandemic, which is very important for our conversations. And that is learning lessons from the pandemic. Pandemics end only when we learn lessons from them. And I think one lesson that in my view we have learned, and it has been underlined by all the presentations today, is that when we talk about the relationship between humans, and we also talk about hierarchy, we should now also be looking at very closely and carefully at the relationship between the world of the humans and the world of the non-humans, which means that we have to go back to the realization, and we have to reinforce this realization with all emphasis at our command, that there is a need now to rethink the entire paradigm of development. If we want to sustain the narratives of sustainable development, if we want to sustain the vision of sustainable development, then we need to move away from the economic growth obsessed, oriented model of development. And I think that has also been reinforced by the pandemic that we are facing right now. And I fully agree with you and other presenters who made this point early on, that pandemics are a crisis, but they are also a moment of opportunity because they push us in the direction of innovation, whether it is epistemic innovation or it is institutional innovation. But one thing is very clear, that when we enter, and hopefully sooner than later, the post-COVID normal, we will have to very closely rethink the conventional understandings of sovereignty, security, and sustainability. So thank you very, very much, Professor Mattu. I can go on and on in response to very thought-provoking presentation of yours, but I think I'll stop here. And maybe Carl would like to invite questions and comments if there are any. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, sir, for those enlightening words. With that, I would like to invite Pratna Putran, Research Associate, the Bridge Project, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Sugandhana. So I would, good evening everyone. I'm Prarthana. I'm a research associate at the Bridge Project. And today, on behalf of the organizing committee of the panel discussion, I would like to propose a vote of thanks to each and everyone who has contributed towards the success of today's event. First of all, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all the panelists who have taken time out of their schedule and shared their insights. It has been an intellectual treat. We would like to thank Professor Matu, Professor Chaturvedi, and Dr. Tripathi for being a guiding light throughout. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank South Asian University for collaborating with us. We look forward to future events. I would also like to thank our digital media partner, The Logical Indian, and a print media partner, Seasonal Magazine, for their association. Also, we are exceedingly grateful to all our audience who participated in the webinar throughout. I hope you gained much more information about the topic and enjoyed as much as we did. So, all the webinar links will be put out on our YouTube channel very shortly. So stay tuned for more updates. Please feel free to follow the Bridge Project on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also check out our website at www.thebridgeproject.in. So please stay tuned for more updates and we'll meet soon. Take care and have a nice day.